Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a pleasure for me to be once again in St. Anselm College. I was here, I think, 3 years ago to lecture. Some of you may have been present then, already then at the invitation of Professor Bodo. And I have a good recollection, a good memory of my first visit. You have heard something about my background, and thus you know that I speak to you as somebody who was trained in Protestant theology, mainly in Germany, who later sought to link theology and the social sciences, and that apart from some periods of university teaching, in particular 10 years of teaching systematic theology and ecumenics in one of our German faculties, I've spent most of my professional life serving the World Council of Churches, this large and most representative international organization of Christian communities throughout the world. At present, as a retired former general secretary, former professor, former pastor, I'm involved in reflection and research and writing on issues of religion and politics, especially in relation to the search for a new world order. And this is the background against which I will try to develop my response to the question which forms the title of my talk tonight. Do we witness a re-enchantment of the world? I will start with a preliminary reflection. It has become fairly common among students and observers of social developments to speak of a resurgence of religion. Reference is usually made to the strong public profile of new religious movements in all religious traditions and to their increasing impact on shaping public policy. One of the first manifestations of this resurgence was the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, to be followed by several expressions of a militant political Islam. But in the course of 1980s, similar developments took place in a variety of contexts, from the role that Christian churches and Christian movements have played in bringing to an end the communist rule in Eastern Europe, the subsequent revitalization of the Orthodox Christian tradition in Russia and other formerly communist countries in Eastern Europe, the sometimes violent campaigns in India aiming at establishing a social order based on Hindu values, the strong influence of conservative evangelical circles in shaping the policy of successive US administrations since the presidency of Ronald Reagan, to the crucial role that Orthodox Jewish groups and political parties have begun to play in Israeli politics. Speaking of a resurgence of religion seems to suggest that this is an unexpected development that calls for some explanation. And it certainly reflects the assumption about the continuing decrease of the role of religion in modern societies, assumptions which were shared by a large majority of socially and politically informed intellectuals, and many of them still hold on to these assumptions. They were part of a generalized theory about the process of modernization, which was said to lead inevitably to the secularization in the sense of a decline of religious influence on public life and to the progressive privatization of religion. This theory, the foundations for which were laid by the pioneers of modern sociology, Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, has been the uncontested core of modern sociology during much of the 20th century. Empirically, this thesis that secularization is an inevitable consequence of modernization seemed to correlate well with the developments in Europe, where Christian churches over these last 100 years have indeed lost much of their traditional influence in society, and where religious practice has become largely privatized. Among sociologists, it was of course known that the United States offered a somewhat different picture, being the vanguard of the processes of modernization, but remaining solidly religious at the same time. Generally, the situation in the United States was considered to be an exception from the rule, and it was further taken for granted that the same process of secularization, including the privatization, if not the decline of religion, that this process would take place in those parts of the world that were only at the beginning stage of the process of modernization, that is to say in Africa and in Asia. For those who shared these assumptions, the developments referred to above constituted indeed an unexpected turn of events. This is also true for many contemporary political leaders whose understanding of politics was shaped by secular rationality and who were committed to defending the secular character of the state over against ethno-religious claims. In fact, for many of them, and many of the movements referred to above appeared to constitute a fundamental threat to the functioning of a liberal democratic political system. While these people were not necessarily anti-religious, they shared the conviction that religion was essentially a matter of private conviction to be kept away from the public space. However, over the last 15 years, the assumptions underlying the theories of modernization and secularization have been subjected to critical scrutiny. To begin with, the Israeli social scientist Shmuel Eisenstadt has raised fundamental questions regarding the assumption that the development of modernity in Europe, beginning with the Renaissance in the 15th century and then being shaped by the influence of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, reflected a quasi-normative pattern of historical development that would have to be repeated in all contexts that had come into contact with the forces of industrialization and had undergone the process of social differentiation. He suggested to distinguish between the institutional, the structural, and the cultural dimensions of modernization, and to consider modernity primarily as a cultural project that would lead to different institutional and structural responses depending on the social and historical conditions of the respective context. Thus, he began to introduce the concept of multiple modernities as a way to account, among others, for the fact that countries shaped by Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or Confucian tradition could very well accept modern economic and political patterns without losing or questioning their profound commitment to religion. Modernization and secularization, in this sense, are not as tightly linked as the general theory had postulated. Further, the more attention was being focused on the so-called resurgence of religion, it became evident that religion had never disappeared from the life world of people, even in the most secularized regions. Some of its traditional, collective, and institutional expressions had been weakened by the impact of colonialism and subsequent westernization, but people were now turning to religion in order to affirm and defend their identities against the cultural impact of modernity. What is more, closer analysis reveals that the effects of secularization postulated by the theory are largely limited to Europe. And it's Europe that represents the exceptional case, not the United States. Thus, the American sociologist José Casanova comes to the conclusion, and I quote him, "From a global historical perspective, the series of changes we call secularization evince an internal dynamic unique to a particular form of religious regime, namely Western Christendom and its Catholic and Protestant derivatives, which has very few parallels in other world religions, or even in the oldest and most traditional forms of Christianity, the Eastern Church." That's far the quote. Another influential American sociologist, Peter Berger, who had earlier been a strong advocate of the secularization theory, has come to the conclusion, and I quote, that the assumption that we live in a secularized world is false. The world today is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever. This means that a whole body of literature by historians and social scientists loosely labeled secularization theory is essentially mistaken. End of the quote. This statement is part of a book edited by Berger under the title The Desecularization of the World, Resurgent Religion and World Politics in 1999. As with the term resurgence of religion, one can debate whether desecularization is an adequate description of the changes and developments referred to above. However, it points to the fact that at least some of the theories with which social scientists and also the discourse of social and political elites have been working during these past decades are in need of serious reassessment. That's the preliminary. Now, more specifically to the question of re-enchantment. Turning thus to the topical question, whether we witness a re-enchantment of the world, you will understand perhaps why I approach my response to this question with this general introduction about the secularization debate. In fact, the notion of re-enchantment refers back to an affirmation by one of the originators of the secularization theory, the German sociologist Max Weber. While his French contemporary Emil Durkheim had attributed the dynamic of secularization to the progressive differentiation of society, leading to the emancipation of the fields of politics, economy, law, education, and the arts from the traditional unified cultural framework and its normative religious foundations, Max Weber had focused his investigations on the emergence of the modern intellectual and cultural pattern with its emphasis on instrumental rationality, the spirit of rational calculation, and the expectation of continuing progress through the mastery of the forces and laws of nature. Through his research on the great religious traditions of the world, Weber came to the conclusion that it was the link between Greek philosophy and the Jewish-Christian dynamic which prepared the ground for the emergence of this unique intellectual and cultural pattern, which came to its full expression through the impact of the European Enlightenment and the ethical influence of the Protestant Reformation. In a lecture on the topic Science as a Vocation, delivered in 1919, shortly before his death, Weber summarized his interpretation of this modern form of rationality, which has become the foundation of scientific work. In comparing this mentality with traditional approaches to the world, he speaks in this lecture of an inevitable process of disenchantment. since this mentality is based on the conviction, and I quote, that principally there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. One need no longer have recourse to magical means in order to master or implore the spirits, as did the savage, for whom such mysterious powers existed. Technical means and calculations perform this service. This, above all, is what intellectualization means. It's a process of disenchantment which has continued to exist in Occidental culture for millennia, and in general, this progress to which science belongs as a link and motive force. End of quote. The term disenchantment here is used to mark the fundamental difference of this approach to the world of human existence from that of primal religions, for whom the world was influenced and controlled by spirits and superhuman powers, and where magic was one of the ways to enter into contact with these powers or to avert the influence of evil spirits. Of course, Weber was fully conscious of the fact that with the emergence of the worldviews represented by the traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Greek philosophy, and of ancient Israel, and especially with the reinterpretation of the transcendent reality in terms of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim monotheism, the character of the religious approach to the world had changed fundamentally and could no longer be interpreted in terms of the magical worldview of primal religions. However, his point was to explain that modern science as the clearest expression of the rationalization of the world operates on the conviction that there are no mysterious forces that are beyond human investigation and that cannot be brought under the control of human instrumental mastery. As a scientist, Weber felt that he could not respond to questions that go beyond the limits of scientific rationality and its technical or practical implications. He observed with profound skepticism and a sense of concern the tendency among the young generation of his time to turn away from the cold rationalism of the scientific technological worldview and to try to reappropriate, for instance, in the movement of expressionism, a movement among artists in the early 20th century, the non-rational dimensions of the arts and poetry. Considering the youth movements of his own time, he sees their craving for genuine experience, especially religious experience. But he feels that, and I quote him once more, this method of emancipation from intellectualism may well bring about the very opposite of what those who take to it conceive as its goal. He could, of course, not know that the youth movements that were very strong at that time would ultimately lead into fascist National Socialism in Germany, and therefore lead indeed to the very contrary of what they originally had conceived. Of course, he respects the longing for some form of meaning of human life, a sense of belonging and recognition that goes beyond the explanations that science can offer. He refers with respect to the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, who for his generation had admitted quite clearly, and I quote, "Science is meaningless because it gives no answer to the only question important for us, what shall we do and how shall we live? The only question that remains Weber adds, is the sense in which science gives no answer, and whether or not science might yet be of some use to those who put the question correctly. Towards the end of his lecture, Weber concludes, and I quote him for the last time, "The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. Precisely the ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life, either into the transcendental realm of mystic life or into the brotherliness of direct and personal human relationships. It is not accidental that our greatest art is intimate and not monumental, nor is it accidental that today only within the smallest and intimate circles, in personal human situations, almost in pianissimo, that something is pulsating that corresponds to the prophetic pneuma, which in former times swept through the great communities like a firebrand, welding them together. It should be clear, Weber adds, that genuine prophecy can never be produced, least of all by science. To those who cannot bear the fate of our time, namely the fate of rationalization and intellectualization, he recommends to return to the wide open arms of the religious communities, that is to say, the churches. But they should be aware of the intellectual sacrifice that is involved in embracing a religious conviction. He would respect such a return since, in any case, it stands higher than the academic prophecy, which does not clearly realize that in the lecture room of the universities, no other virtue holds but plain intellectual honesty. That's the last quote of Weber. So much for presenting Weber's thought on the disenchantment of the world. And I felt I needed to start from that point before talking about the re-enchantment of the world. In an article published in the year 2000, the Harvard theologian Francis Schüssler-Fiorenza takes issue with Weber's affirmation that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. He refers to the more recent results of scientific investigation, especially in modern physics, that suggest that there may be limits to our capacity to know and calculate the forces that govern the world. Most of the forces we seek to control do yield to our examination and control, more or less. But current research complicates matters by examining phenomena that simply may not yield to our mastery. This is, of course, more than of purely theoretical interest because it challenges the basic assumption underlying Weber's thesis of the inevitable disenchantment of the world. Schüssler-Fiorenza concludes his essay, I quote, "We may not be approaching the re-enchantment of the world, but we may be approaching the end of the disenchantment of the world. The world is stranger and holds more possibility than our compartmentalized rationalizations acknowledge. Weber assumes that technical means and calculations will serve human needs more adequately than magical means. This may be true, but Weber must have a limited view of what reality is at play in human life. Not all human needs can be served by calculated technical means. A truly vital religion will certainly not seek to overthrow rationality, nor will it seek to re-establish a lost world. Indeed, a vital religion will link the human desire for ultimate meaning, the ultimate human need, with a rationally disciplined ethic. Above all, it will recognize the need for humility before a world that sets the ultimate limits for us and not we for it. Now, third step in my response to the question, the lead question that we have to consider, is what is meant by re-enchantment. For Weber, the distinctive characteristic of an enchanted world was the notion that the world was inhabited and controlled by spirits and powers that could be made benevolent and benign by way of magic and ritual. In particular, nature was seen not in the first instance as an object for human mastery, but as a living organism, as a partner to be treated with respect by humans. We witness traces of this primal relationship with the natural world among indigenous cultures that speak of Mother Earth or Mother Nature and insist that the viability of human community ultimately depends on maintaining this intimate relationship with nature, with the soil, with plants, with trees, with animals. Indigenous art is full of symbols to express this understanding of human life as intimately bound up with the natural universe and its cyclical movements. Some critical natural scientists, like James Lovelock or Fritjof Capra, have tried to recapture this worldview by way of the Gaia hypothesis, referring with this notion to the Earth as a living planet on which living things together with the air, the oceans, and the rocks all combine into one. And new discoveries in molecular biology provide us with an insight into the ways in which human life is bound up with all life on Earth, and thus utterly dependent on the integrity of the ecosystem. We may indeed not be approaching a re-enchantment in the sense of a return to the magical attitude towards the world around us, even though some expressions of New Age thinking seem to come close to it. But the challenge to the culture of rationalism is being articulated not only from within the scientific community, but comes in particular form from the ecofeminist movement in its fundamental criticism of the dualism between nature and human culture, and its exposure of patriarchy, that is to say, the hierarchical placement of the male over the female, as the main reason for the broken relationship between human community and its natural origins. Another challenge directed against the cold rationalism of scientific explanation is specifically leveled against the theory of evolution through the counter-theories of creationism or intelligent design as variations of a postulated process of re-enchantment. Of course, with the daunting ecological crisis, especially with the threat of global warming for the sustainability of life of the human community and the rapid extinction of living species that have served to maintain the ecological balance through millennia, we have no need to refer to any postmodern theory, and creationism or intelligent design are as postmodern as are the New Age theories. We have no need to refer to any of these theories to understand that the culture of instrumental rationality and of cost-benefit calculation is no longer ensuring progress, but might indeed have unleashed a self-destructive dynamic. Our economy, our social structures, our lifestyles, with their dependency on science-based technology and on the assumption of rational choice as the way to prosperity, turn out to be non-sustainable in the long run. And the present financial and economic crises seem to indicate that this long run may be less far away than many had assumed so far. The loss of confidence in the promises of progress of science and technology, that the progress of science and technology would be able to resolve all problems and master the challenges arising from human interference with the delicate balances of the natural world. This loss of confidence has led to a widespread sense of insecurity and uncertainty, which has been aggravated by the evident inability or unwillingness of those in leadership responsibility to tackle the issues of glaring inequality, of hunger, poverty, and disease among growing numbers of the world's population. Many studies point to the fact that it is this situation of insecurity and disillusionment with regard to the secular, rationalistic, and materialistic culture that has made people turn to religion in their search to find a place of belonging that can offer meaning to their lives. Religious narratives and symbols begin to speak to people more eloquently and convincingly than scientific explanations and prognosis. Less and less they feel that opening themselves to religious dimensions requires an intellectual sacrifice. In fact, they begin to discover that religious faith convictions sometimes indeed offer a more realistic view of the human condition than does modern science. In any case, the question how faith and reason are related, can be related to one another, which was passionately debated for several generations, has become a focus of new interest by philosophers, scientists, and people of religion who do not share Weber's skepticism at this point. It is against this background that the so-called resurgence of religion takes on a new quality. This is true in particular of the many non-traditional movements that have been formed mostly by lay people in the different traditions, from Buddhism to Muslim reform movements, and to the many of such groups in the Catholic Church. The most spectacular development is certainly the spread of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity over the last decades, which has now become the most lively profile of the Christian tradition in the postmodern world. Pentecostal and charismatic communities are not necessarily anti-modernistic, and this is true also for the Buddhist and Muslim reform movements. They are not advocating a return to a pre-scientific magical worldview, but they seek to reintroduce into their respective cultures a fresh awareness of the spiritual dimension of the life in human community. With their celebration of a direct experience of divine presence through the power of the Holy Spirit, the Pentecostal and charismatic movements point to one of the critical legacies that the Christian tradition has bequeathed on Western modernity, that is to say, the total desacralization of the world and the cutting of any links between God and the world. It is true that early Christianity maintained and defended the understanding of the world as God's good creation over against the tendencies of Gnostic or Manichaean dualism. Such dualism reappears today in the different forms of fundamentalist apocalyptic scenarios that see the world as being doomed to destruction in the final battle between the forces of light and darkness. Over against such visions, early Christianity had strongly affirmed that the Creator God had entered into a covenantal relationship with God's creation and will lead it to its final consummation. However, the strong anthropocentric orientation of Christian thinking saw humans as the crown of creation. It interpreted the biblical affirmation that the human person has been created in the image and likeness of God, in the sense that humans had been endowed by their Creator with the capacity for reason, and thus had been set up to be the masters or co-creators and stewards of creation. Creation had thus been separated from its divine origins and given over into the hands and the responsibility of humans, as the space and the basis for human culture to be developed. Creation had been marked by the imprint of divine purpose in the form of the eternal orders of creation. But human reason had the capacity to discern these orders and turn them into tools and instruments for human cultural achievements. These divine orders were first secularized in the encounter with Stoic philosophy into natural law, and eventually, through the Enlightenment and the emergence of modern science, turned into laws of nature, which could be discerned with the powers of human reason and then serve as the basis for human industry and technology. In the mechanistic Newtonian worldview, God had become utterly transcendent and removed from the world. It was this deistic image of God as the watchmaker who had provided his perfect creation with the capacity to function according to its innate laws without any further divine interference. This is the basis of what Max Weber has called the disenchantment of the world. We have thus to acknowledge that the process of secularization and disenchantment has its roots in the development of the Christian tradition and its particular reception of the Hebrew biblical witness. However, today we begin to rediscover, and you realize that I have meanwhile moved from my social science background and interests to my theological training. Today we begin to rediscover that both the Hebrew Bible and the teachings of the New Testament testify to a broader understanding of God's relationship with the world as God's creation. Certainly, the affirmation of the critical distinction between God as creator and the world as God's creation, and not as in itself divine and sacred, provided a liberating view of the world over against the sacralization of nature and the various fertility cults. It liberated human life from the sense of utter dependency on the forces of nature and their cyclical dynamic, thus opening perspectives for human history. However, both the Hebrew Bible, especially the Psalms, and the New Testament, especially the letters of St. Paul, affirm that God has not withdrawn from creation, but continues to be present within creation through God's Spirit, nurturing and empowering life. In the Psalms, all of creation, the sea, the rocks, the trees, the animals, participate in praising the Creator. The Hebrew Bible is full of images and metaphors of an enchanted world. And even the creation narratives, which have for a long time been read as authorization for human mastery and domination of the world, are now being reread and rediscovered as carriers of a strong ecological message, which entrusts humanity with the responsibility to care for creation as the gardener cares for the garden. One of the strongest images of God's continuing creative presence in the world through the divine Spirit is found in Psalm 104. All living beings look to God to give them their food they need. And then the psalm continues, when you give to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away your breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are recreated, and you renew the face of the ground. Psalm 104, verses 28 to 30. The Spirit is God's power of creation and the life force of all creatures. Through the workings of the Spirit in the world, God maintains God's creation against the forces of chaos and destruction. And it is in this line that St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, develops his powerful vision of creation groaning in labor pains, waiting to be set free from bondage to decay, to obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God, Romans 8:18. The gift of God's Spirit is, in fact, an anticipation of that eschatological reality when God's covenant of peace and righteousness with humanity and all of creation will be consummated. The world was created through the power of the Spirit, and it is this same power that continues to transform and prepare the world for its final consummation. In the contemporary discussion about a Christian response to the ecological crisis, this powerful biblical narrative is being rediscovered as a source of inspiration and transformative action. Whether we want to call this a re-enchantment of the world, I leave to your decision. It certainly opens our eyes to the beauty and the fragility of creation, and can teach us to accept in humility our own finiteness and to unmask the notion of unlimited progress as an ideological narrative that has lost its credibility. It challenges us to acknowledge that we have become captives of accumulation and growth as ends in themselves. Growth for growth's sake is the destructive strategy of the cancer cell. In rereading the design of God's creation, we discover a pattern of growth that is linked to the process of maturation and leads through death to the emergence of new life. In our use of energy and natural resources, we begin to rediscover and learn to respect the regenerative powers of creation. So, to end, my answer to the topical question, as you see, would be similar to the one quoted from Francis Schüssler Fiorenza. We witness a profound transformation of human consciousness and the need to move beyond the conditions of a disenchanted world. But we may not approach a genuine re-enchantment. For once the critical distinction between immanence and transcendence, between God and the world, has entered into human consciousness, there is no way back into the innocence of the enchanted cosmos of primal traditions. However, the religious and symbolic narratives, not only of the Christian tradition, but equally of the other world religions, are beginning to speak more eloquently again today and offer dimensions of meaning, challenging the rationalism and materialism of a culture that has lost the critical sense of self-transcendence. The implications of this transformation on our sense of values and of the purpose of human life and community are still to be spelled out. There are some indications that the attraction and influence of traditionalist, morally conservative, or fundamentalist movements might grow, and that we might witness even more instances of militant, religiously based identity politics. It will be important how we respond to these developments, and that whether we can consider them not as threat to the maintenance of a secular social or political culture, but as manifestations of that difficult process of the transformation of human consciousness in the search of spiritual discernment. That's as far as I've come in my reflections on a topic that was proposed by Professor Bodo. I accepted the challenge, and you have been the victims of my attempt to come to terms with the challenge. Thank you very much for your patience.
Dale Keene, the director of the Institute of Politics. You spoke about European exceptionalism and that the secularization thesis was unique for Europe. I was wondering if you could explain why did that secularization happen in Europe? And you haven't said necessarily that Europe will be re-enchanted, but what hope you might have that Europe might move toward that?
I've quoted José Casanova, and I agree with his observation that the specific processes that we now call secularization should be read essentially as processes of liberation from a particular regime of institutionalized religion over against a particular form of government. That is to say, a monarchical absolutist political structure over against a dominant hierarchically structured religious organization. These two poles in historical tension, conflict, competition with one another about the ultimate control of the orientation of public life. This pattern has emerged in the European Christian history. It started with the Constantinian covenant and was continued through the Middle Ages. It was even preserved after the Reformation, because essentially the system cuius regio eius religio is a continuation of the same fundamental structure, now only on the territorial level instead of the imperial level as before. So secularization in Europe is part of the process of liberation from that framework. And it is specifically directed against a shape of church as part of a governing structure, exercising power and control over people's lives. The development in the United States have, from the start, followed a different logic because the United States was shaped by people who have emigrated from Europe precisely in order to escape that framework. The framework of state religion over against a divinely constituted monarchical political system. And these particular developments have no parallel in any of the other world religions. The history of the Muslim community, Buddhist or Hindu history, has led to different configurations in the relationship between religion and society or religion and politics. And it is for this reason that the process of secularization has, in the way it has developed, has remained essentially limited to the European context, which does not mean that religion has disappeared, but it has taken on a different form.
It seems to me that free will is sort of the defining factor in the difference between the primal religions and our current, not necessarily re-enchantment, but like reorientation. So I was wondering if you could talk about free will and our understanding of it and the effect that'll have on the environmental crisis and our understanding of being good stewards.
Could you come a little closer to them?
Oh, sure. Just the effect of free will and our current understanding of it on the environmental crisis and our understanding of being good stewards, because you mentioned that. Good stewards of the earth and the environment.
Yes.
And what role does our current understanding of free will have on that?
I mean, the emphasis on free will is, first of all, a critical stance over against a notion of ultimate determinism, that human action is conditioned by processes that follow closely laws of nature and whose causal chain can therefore be determined, and that there is no space for the intervention of any force outside that which can be determined empirically as a consequence of scientific investigation. Now, I think even among scientists, among neurobiologists, there is more and more skepticism with regard to the notions of a closed, deterministic view of human nature, and therefore readiness to admit that there are dimensions of indetermination, just as in the nuclear physical realm, the investigations of nuclear science has led to the indetermination principle of Heisenberg, which does not deny the validity of natural law, but accounts for the fact that the intervention of human agency into the causal chain has an influence on the results and the effects. So I think in terms of the ecological crisis, we are not, in the sense, delivered to the unfolding of a drama that follows a determined sequence of events, but there is the possibility, and that is, I think, meant with the notion of the stewardship of creation. There is the possibility to shape and intervene in the further development of creation. Creation is not, in the sense of, it's not a final product that then only follows its innate laws, but there is a history of creation that leads forward to its consummation, and it is in this history that the human community, that humanity, is called upon to cooperate with God in the final shaping of creation. It's an abstract response to a question that has much more concrete and experiential background, but any discussion about free will is bound to remain to a certain extent abstract.
Thank you.
I'm Rob Masiello. I'm a sophomore at St. A's. You talked about the re-enchantment of the world, and I think at this point there's so many different religions in the world, and people have their own beliefs, and as you examine them and break them down, it seems like the lines between them seem to blur, And I was just wondering, at what point do you think that we break it down too much, like to a point that they would lose meaning? How far do you think we can go with that to the point that they lose significance?
They might lose meaning for the disinterested observer and student who looks at religion simply as an object of study, comparing religion and thus losing any sense of particular profile in the process of comparative religious study. They certainly don't lose profile for the adherents who are filled with commitment to a particular religious tradition, but who do not feel necessarily that holding on to their tradition places everybody else into a situation of ignorance or error. That my being faithful to my tradition obliges me to struggle against or to seek to convince everybody else that they should join my conviction. It may very well be that while my conviction does represent truth and is rooted in ultimate truth, that there are other ways of relating to ultimate truth that have not been revealed to me, but that I have every reason to respect. And I think it is this sense of respect for the integrity of ultimate conviction that is slowly growing as a consequence of dialogue between religions. The sense that it is time that we overcome the sense of exclusive claims, the sense of enmity or the differentiation between us and them, but we begin to relate to one another as being engaged in a common search for what ultimately is the destination of humanity.
Thank you.
Father John from the philosophy department. Thank you for your talk, Konrad. I'd like to kind of follow up on this question, but also something that you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture regarding the resurgence of religion. You mentioned Islam in Iran, the Hindus in India, the Hebrew religion in Israel, and the resurgence of Orthodox Christianity in Russia and in Eastern Europe. All of these have been highly exclusive of other forms of religion to the point of being violent or at least even threatening to them. So I'm wondering if this resurgence is something that we should look on favorably or not.
It is true that certain features of this resurgence take on militant, aggressive, even violent character. But this is not true for the phenomenon as a whole. It isn't true for Orthodox Judaism as a whole. It is true for certain segments of Orthodox Judaism. It is certainly not true for the renaissance and revitalization of Hinduism, but it is true for the militant Hindu nationalist groups that use the revitalization of Hinduism as an ideology for the promotion of particular political interests. And I could go on. I think in all the cases where this resurgence takes on a militant, violent, aggressive character, it is the consequence of religion being used as a means to mobilize people in what are essentially political power struggles for the purposes of politics of identity, as it is called today. And therefore, there is an increasing need and, in fact, sensitivity in the context of interreligious dialogue, to see what are the means by which religious communities can be protected, can be strengthened in their capacity to resist the manipulation, the functionalization, the instrumentalization of religious loyalties for political ends. So the quest for a new separation, distinction between what is the character of political action and what is the character of religious action comes home to all those involved in studying and understanding this religious resurgence, and I think is today one of the most intensively debated points. Once you begin to study these developments, then you discover, of course, as well, that religious communities and the religious revitalization has in fact, in many instances, led to new forms of reconciliation. In the institute that Hans Küng has formed in Germany on his project of a global ethic, a study has been undertaken about the ways in which religious communities have effectively acted as mediators, as sources of reconciliation and peace in conflict situations. And it is very surprising. He has gathered this author has gathered 42 case studies in which there is an empirical evidence of a significant influence of revitalized religious convictions and loyalties as a source of reconciliation and conflict resolution in new civil conflicts around questions of resources, around questions of land, around questions of access to power, etc.
Hi, my name's Andrew Ross. I'm a sophomore physics major here at St. A's. First of all, thanks for coming. And so, said I'm a physics major. When I want answers, I look to science and not really to religion. And I read a lot about, famous scientists. I mean, you've got Albert Einstein and Carl Sagan. I'm reading one of Richard Dawkins's books right now. And common theme is an awe for creation or the universe or whatever you want to call it, inspired by the understanding of it through science. And you spoke about the disenchantment of the world through science and mechanistic views and Newton. How would you respond to a scientist who sees the enchantment of the universe through science?
Well, you have referred yourself to some of the eminent scientists who, as a consequence of their intensive scientific endeavors, have reached the point where they had to acknowledge that the scientific approach to the understanding of our world touches limits of what can be known and can be discovered with the means of science. And that there is, in fact, a realm, the access to which follows a different logic, different methodologies. And so Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, they have ended their lives with a profound reappreciation of the capacity of symbolic language provided by religion, not in the sense of challenging the validity of science, but in helping science to see that with the elements of human rationality and scientific explanation, you only reach one half. And you need to put the whole together again, and that means going beyond science. So I think, in a way, we have received one of the strongest impulses in the direction of what our theme for tonight calls re-enchantment of the world from scientific endeavors.
To some extent, the notion of natural law, which has been very useful in development of international law and better relation in the world, has been developed at the same beginning of a notion of rationality, which has become the instrumental rationality that you indicated. So to what extent can this notion of natural law be still useful to recreate, if not to re-enchant, to have a new kind of a world order, which is a more, which is viable?
Mm-hmm. I indicated that the emergence of the notion of natural law was in itself the consequence of a process of desacralization, of a view of the world as permeated by a dynamic, a structure of divinely established order. And it is through the instruments of Greek, in particular Stoic philosophy, that this was first of all transformed into natural law, and natural law then became the model upon which, in the process of secularization, the laws of nature were formulated. But this seems to presuppose that ultimately all processes in at least the natural world follow strictly natural laws that can be discerned by human rationality. And that presupposes that the form of human reason, human rationality, is, as it were, the microcosm of the order of the world as such. So that because of the correspondence between the shape of the human mind and the inner structure and logic of the world, human reason has the capacity to discern what ultimately holds the world together. But this is an understanding that is based on the very separation between the origin, the created God, and the created world. So it reduces the interplay between transcendent divine reality and historical human reality. It reduces it to the immanence, exclusively. And it is precisely at that point that the very notion of natural laws reaches their limits as well. The very struggle among nuclear physicists to come to terms with a philosophical, convincing interpretation of quantum physics is an example, because in the field of quantum physics, our ability to formulate natural laws or laws of nature reaches its limits mathematically and philosophically. And therefore, what is true in the most minute of the building elements of our world, of course, becomes even more so true as you take a comprehensive view of the world and the laws that govern it.
I'm Drew Sear. I'm a freshman politics major. You talked about how the re-enchantment might be how different religions would interact with modernity, and how they would mend together and work together. And Father John talked about the resurgence and how a lot of them are violent and have militant uprisings. Could there be a connection with those resurgences' inability to interact correctly and civilly with modernity and not be able to mend, as well as maybe religions that were more affected by the Reformation?
I hope that I have understood your question. Most of these movements of resurgent religion are themselves already a response to modernity, and in that sense are a product of modernity. They represent a search to go beyond the sheer imposition of modernity. And therefore, they should be understood as manifestations of that critical process of transformation of human consciousness that I have spoken about at the very end. Neither of these movements, whether you talk about Islamism, Muslim fundamentalism, whether you talk about Jewish fundamentalism, whether you talk about Hindu nationalism, or about evangelical fundamentalism, none of these movements can claim to have the ultimate response to what is a process of searching beyond the confines that have been established by modernity. And to the extent that we succeed in overcoming the defensive attitude over against what seems to be, at the first instance, an aggressive, a militant process that provokes a similarly militant and potentially violent response. To the extent that we succeed to overcome the defensiveness of the response, we will discover that there are possibilities of engaging each other in that search for responses that reach beyond the limits of modernity. That is true in particular in the difficult relationship between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. That dialogue is probably among the most difficult to engage, but at the same time, one of the most urgent. And in all three cases, for the time being, the tendency to respond defensively to the respective movements on the other side is predominant. So I think much will depend on whether we can find ways of overcoming that instinctive or spontaneous or unreflective defensive response that interprets the challenge as an invitation to struggle and to finally engage in a confrontation where only one side can win. The clash of civilizations that was projected by Samuel Huntington is one of these responses over against that tendency. No less an authority than the former president of the Iranian Islamic Republic, Khatami, has in the late 1990s proposed to the United Nations to start a dialogue of civilizations, not to end up with the clash of civilizations. And the need to spell out the dynamics and the rules of this dialogue, which is not, it's not the dialogue among experts of an elite who talk about religious doctrines, but it's the dialogue of life, of those who share the same space, politically, socially, economically, culturally, but who are part of different religious traditions and who have to work out ways of living together non-exclusively and engage each other in creative interaction. This sometimes has the character of a blue-eyed utopian image, which doesn't seem to take seriously the realities on the ground. But then you are invited by some of those who are very close to the realities on the ground to move directly in this direction. I'm thinking now of an initiative in Kaduna, in the north of Nigeria, between an imam of the Muslim community and a Baptist pastor, who found themselves initially on two sides of militantly confrontational groups who both have suffered severely under this violent clash, who have lost members of their own families and who have received wounds themselves physically, and who've come to the conclusion this cannot be the way for us. And so they have initiated in Kaduna a process of slowly moving towards each other. They have formulated a platform of reconciliation between the Christian and the Muslim community, which has now become a model in the north of Nigeria. They have been invited to a neighboring state that had faced the same situation to help them to move out of the clinch and develop a more constructive relationship to one another. So there are examples on the ground, and it is worthwhile to study the dynamics of those who have had to deal with this as a matter of daily life or survival, and not simply as a theoretical and abstract issue to be discussed academically.
Jonathan Acuff, Politics. Thank you, Dr. Raiser, for a call, I think, as I read it, to a sensible re-embedding of faith and spirituality into the social life of humans that seems so tragically bereft of it so often as of late. The utopian idealist in me hopes you're right, but I'm also a trained social scientist, so I'm going to offer alternative hypothesis, because I think you are making a prediction in your speech, in your discussion, that is essentially that we have exhausted the material and intellectual resources available to us from social science and from science itself to explain our world and to help us understand how to use its resources properly. That seems to me a prediction. And since you have quoted so effectively from Max Weber, I will take a hypothesis, derive one from Weber as well. At the end of the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he speaks for several pages about what Talcott Parsons probably famously mistranslated as the iron cage, which I guess is properly translated as the steel hard casing. I'm not sure that distinction makes any difference, but nonetheless, Weber was saying that bereft of any true spiritual calling. We are left but stuck in this rationalized cage, nevertheless amusing ourselves with kind of hysterical entertainment, for lack of a better way of putting it. That's essentially what Weber, I read, is saying. Something he's writing in the early 20th century. And I would suggest an alternative hypothesis derived from Weber that the charisma of liberal rationalist utopia may persist even in the dramatic problems we're facing right now, in the sense that particularly the young have found technical ways to absent themselves from reality in increasing droves that we used to do only in a spiritual sense, and they're doing so technologically. That is the creation of synthetic worlds by computers. And the number of adherents to these sorts of worlds are growing dramatically. And this, in my view, tragically, may provide a potential outlet for people who would normally be sensibly returning to the spiritual world of faith, and instead taking a sort of escape valve or escape hatch, using the same liberal, technical, rational belief of the world to escape from its consequences. How should we, as people of faith, draw in those folks to perhaps a more sensible way of dealing with reality? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, first of all, I think this is, if it is a true description, is a phenomenon and a development that has a fairly limited reach, that is to say, to only those who have access to the instrumental means that provide them with this escape route. For the vast majority of the world's population who suffer from the digital divide, this escape is no option. So it remains a game among a privileged minority who are struggling to maintain or to come to terms with the decay of their privileges. For the vast majority of the world's population, it will remain the case, as I quoted from Peter Berger, that they will continue to link modernity, problematic modernity, with their religious traditions, and that, in fact, the religious resurgence will get stronger the more the promises of modernity will turn out to be illusory. So in that sense, I think what probably should be our response to those in the young generation in our part of the world who are tempted to move in this direction is to open their eyes to the realities of the world around them, to open their eyes to move beyond the narrow horizon of our Western, highly developed, sophisticated world, and any effort on their part to spend half a year in Africa, in Asia, and to expose themselves to that fundamental sense of insecurity that is the daily reality of the lives of people there, will explain to them why it is that for so many of our contemporaries, the symbols and the narrative of religious traditions begin to speak louder and more convincingly, even though with discordant voices and not in a coherent manner and not in the sense that they provide a succinct and comprehensive interpretation of everything that puzzles us in the world around us, but they provide at least a profound sense of meaning and purpose that the promises of economic and political progress have long since lost. So I see the validity of what you describe as one possible development. We cannot and shouldn't try to prevent it, but engage those who follow this line in another round of critical discourse in the search for discernment that is ahead for us in any case. So it's a critical encounter just as much as with those who feel tempted to join militant movements of religious fundamentalism.